Welcome to the Better with Age podcast. I'm your host, Galen Wetzel, and today I have the esteemed pleasure to speak with Dr. David Yeager. He's a professor of psychology at the University of Texas at Austin and the co-founder of the Texas Behavioral Science and Policy Institute. He's best known for his research conducted with Carol Dweck, Angela Duckworth, and Greg Walton on short, powerful interventions that influence adolescent behaviors such as motivation, engagement, healthy eating, bullying, stress, mental health, and more. His research has been featured in the New York Times Magazine, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Scientific American, CNN, Fox News, The Guardian, The Atlantic, and more. Clarivate Web of Science ranks Dr. Yeager as one of the top 0.1% most influential psychologists in the world over the past decade. Today we're going to talk all about mentoring, parenting, and leadership. I hope you enjoy our conversation, and if you do, please sure to like and subscribe this podcast for more episodes. All right, Dr. David Yeager, thank you so much for joining me on the Better with Age podcast today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
I must confess, so I originally heard you on another podcast, and I was really struck by, number one, your gift for language, your passion for communicating with young people. I feel like an old person every time I say young kids and the young people these days. But you've done so much research over the years. You know the research so well, and you just have a gift for being able to explain it in a really, I think, accessible way for a lot of people. So I went out and picked your book. For those that are listening, your book is 10 to 25, The Science of Motivating Young People. And I must confess, I haven't read a lot of parenting books in my years. I have a 12-year-old and an 8-year-old as of recording of this. And after I read your book, I was filled with really two competing emotions. And one of them really stemmed from the idea that I recognized myself or my parenting style in one of the less ideal mentoring styles that we'll talk about today. And I was filled with just a little bit of sadness that I had really taken this much time to see how I was parenting, but also filled with this optimism that my kids are still young enough where I can change, and I can hopefully, especially as they're getting to the dreaded teenage years, which a lot of people fear, I can honestly say that I feel optimistic and hopeful and actually excited to be able to guide them into this next phase of their life with many of the tools that you talk about in this book. So just personally, I wanted to thank you for that. And I'm really hopeful that a lot of people listening to this who maybe have kids, but even if you don't, if you're in a position of leadership, that you may be able to get a lot out of this book. So I encourage people to definitely pick it up. So maybe we could start off with just talking basically about what you describe as the mentor's dilemma.
Yeah, so the mentor's dilemma is just very simply the idea that it's very hard to simultaneously criticize somebody's work and motivate them. And it's a dilemma because it doesn't feel like there are any good choices. It feels like on the one hand, we have to be very tough and critical in order to be a good leader and help someone else to improve and grow, but then live with the consequence of having crushed their motivation. Or on the other hand, we could be nice and friendly and caring and withhold our feedback, but then even though we have maybe created a good relationship with a young person, we're not actually helping them to improve. And so we've kind of shirked our responsibility as parents or mentors or leaders. And so for a long time, it felt like those were the only two options. And the way people have tried to resolve that dilemma is with something that is called the compliment sandwich, which is, you give someone lots of bland praise, and then you hit them with a critical feedback and then praise them some more. And it turns out that that doesn't work. It just pushes young people away. And as a result, it's a really frustrating situation where everything from, surgeons who are giving critical feedback to young doctors, to partners at a law firm who have junior associates who need feedback, to a middle school teacher who is writing critical feedback on an essay. In all those cases, you have this problem of the mentor's dilemma, and it causes a lot of frustration.
One of the questions that I have is Is there any cultural context to that? And let me give you just two quick anecdotes for sort of the genesis of my question. So I'm a physical therapist, and I've had a number of physical therapy students in the clinic over the years, and kind of did the compliment sandwich because that's what I knew to do at the time. This went well, but we got to work on this. Oh, but by the way, you're doing really good at this thing. And I had probably some not very good feedback sessions as a result of that. But I also remember about 10 years ago, I was doing some teaching in Kenya, and my role basically was sort of the mentor in the clinic. So I would be working with the Kenyan physios, and I would give them some feedback after a while. And I distinctly remember this one gentleman who had worked with the patient. He didn't do a bad job at all, but as I was giving him feedback, this voice in the back of my head just said, "Uh-oh, like you're laying it on a little thick here maybe, and you don't want to crush this guy's spirits. Like he just drove 3 hours and he's making this huge commitment to be in this program, but I'm giving him this, this feedback. I didn't do the compliment sandwich, I don't think. And I finished, and I just kind of waited there thinking, uh-oh, like did I just break this guy?" And he just sort of paused and he said, "Thank you." Like it was a genuine thank you. He didn't take any sort of insult to it. There was no ego involved. He was just genuinely thankful and hungry to have that feedback. So, is there any cultural difference in terms of how we take feedback?
By cultural, do you mean like different generations or people from different regions of the country or
It
different
could be different regions of the
ethnicities or
world, or like I said, this gentleman from Kenya, very different culture than our culture
yeah.
here in the States.
Yeah, I mean, I think that uh the I guess what the research would say is that anytime there's a power disparity, so there's a higher status person and a lower status person, that there's the possibility for there to be a kind of unspoken conversation that could lead to prickliness or sensitivity. And so in the case you raised, I mean, that could have easily gone wrong, right? I mean, it could have been like you were being exclusive in some way, or you're like trying to um, look down on him. Um, but in those moments where there's a power disparity and someone could take the critical feedback differently, that's where it's especially important to be basically transparent that your critical feedback is coming from a positive place, a place of like wanting to help somebody and so on, or really just that I'm taking you seriously. And I'm taking you seriously because I'm invested in your success. So there might have been something about how you communicated that kind of took off the table the possibility that you were being biased and
Mm,
instead communicated that you were devoting your time and attention to being helpful.
sure.
And that's one of the big lessons from my book is that, a lot of people just focus on did I give feedback or not? But how it's framed and how it is received by the person who gets it can matter a lot. And we can get better at changing how it's received and how it's framed.
For sure. Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about the three different mentorship styles or leadership styles? So even if people don't have children, how, managers or bosses can work with folks that are in this, 10 to 25 age range.
Yeah. So I write a lot about the different ways of resolving this kind of dilemma and really lots of other conflicts between the generations. And what I have found and what other people have found too, I'm summarizing not just my research, but a whole field, is that if all you are is just tough and demanding without any level of support, then you come across as like an authoritarian dictator jerk that is just trying to exclude somebody. And that comes across as like a disrespectful thing to do because in effect you're implying to the lower status person that you're not there to help them, that you can't do anything to support them. And I call that an enforcer mindset, where your philosophy in your mind is just, hey, there's a standard, I'm going to enforce it, and you can meet it or not. It's not up to me to help you meet it. But if you don't, then I'm going to punish you. Maybe there's a little bit of this element of The only way I can get you to take yourself seriously and do a good job is to make you afraid of harsh consequences.
Mm.
And so sometimes there's a push for kind of extreme discipline or threats of negative consequences. That's the enforcer mindset. Um, and I understand why people resort to that. I mean, it's easy to look around at society and think that there's this descent into chaos that's around the corner. And some people say, I'm going to be the last bastion of sanity in this otherwise insane world. Then I'm going to do that by upholding these standards. And I'm not going to be a pushover. Um, but the downside is you come across as this authoritarian jerk, right? Another kind of flaw is a little bit of the opposite. It's where you have very low standards, you don't expect much, but you're very kind and supportive. And that's what I call the protector mindset. And that's the idea that, maybe young people or whoever we're leading has been through so much, they've been through trauma, they've been distressed, and what they really need is for someone to just show that they care. And so I'm going to protect you from stress and threat and being overwhelmed by reducing standards. And again, you can see why people think, yeah, I'm being a good person by doing that. It's because you're not loading someone up with something they can never accomplish. But you can also see how that comes across as a disrespectful thing to
Hmm.
do because it implies that I, as some leader, look down on you and your potential. Like I don't think you can do very much, right? Um, and what I've argued is that the happy medium is to take the best elements of both of those, and that's very high standards and very high support, and that's what I call the mentor mindset. And that's the idea that as a mentor, I'm just aligning my resources with the well-being and growth and development of the person that I'm leading. So I'm thinking about their long-term interests, not just their short-term feelings. And I'm not leaving them to their devices like an enforcer would. I'm walking the journey with them, but I'm also not lowering my standards to protect their feelings. I'm upholding very high standards. And so why do I call this a mindset? I call it a mindset because it really is like a personal philosophy you take to each interaction. You might only talk to somebody once. It's just a side conversation on the street, but that could have an impact on them months
Hmm.
or years into the future.
Yeah.
And so if we're always having this mindset of mentoring, of high standards, high support, aligning my resources with their best interest in the long run, then what we will find is more motivated, engaged young people, people who are independent. They don't need to be yelled at or told what to do or coddled or any of those other things. They can be expected to do important and impressive stuff.
Yeah, I think one of the things that really clicked for me as I was reading your book is I don't know that I had ever really appreciated how detrimental the protector mindset could be. This idea that you want the best for this person, your kid or your employee or whatever it is. So you give them the easiest path and you make little wins as accessible as possible. But as you talked about and as you framed very clearly, it's actually a very harmful thing. And the subtle undertones are, as you just said, I actually don't think you're capable of doing the high standard tasks. So I'm just going to set up softballs for you all day long. And that person never really is able to grow and thrive. So it really was through listening to your descriptions and reading it in the book that I realized how poisonous that can be. But as you said, it's still coming from a place of kindness often, or people who think they're doing the best for their
Yeah.
mentee.
Yeah. I mean, I think, in the 80s and 90s, there was this super interesting research on parenting styles and really influential. And it talked about authoritative parents, which is like a mentor mindset, authoritarian, which is like enforcer, and kind of protective parents, which is like a protector, right? Or permissive is another word for it. And researchers expected to find that parents who did the bad styles like didn't care about their kids, and it was only the parents who did the good styles. But that's not the case. They all cared a lot,
Mhm.
and they just had different fears, and so they managed those fears in different ways.
Mhm.
So the enforcer, their fear is that like society's going to go to hell in a handbasket if they're not the last bastion of sanity in an otherwise insane world. And so the way that they show that they love their children or their students or their mentees is by refusing to relent and having like unrealistically high standards. Okay. The protector also loves, whoever they're caring about. And their way of showing it is to protect you from kind of having another straw being added to your back that causes you to, the camel to crumble on the ground. Right. Um, and so those fears lead to these styles. But where do the fears come from? And what I tried to articulate for the first time is that these parenting styles are not just like a habit. They're a mindset because they grow out of an underlying belief
Mm.
about how young people operate. And the enforcer, if you think that young people are kind of like one bad deed away from getting out of control and ruining everything that adults have created in society, then you think the only way to control them is to threaten them with harsh punishments or maybe, bribe them. But it's all about intense extrinsic motivations for control. The protector has a slightly different belief. They also think young people are incompetent, but they think that the next difficult event is going to set them off
Mm.
and trigger trauma and distress and mental health problems and anxiety and all these other things. And so the way they manage their fears as a result of that belief is by protecting. And ultimately, young people don't like that. I mean, and I've interviewed tons and tons of kids. We did a huge survey. I only report a tiny bit of it in my book, but we were like, all right, well, here's an enforcer. What's an adult in your life who acts like that? How does it make you feel? Here's the definition of a protector. What's an adult in your life who acts like that? And kids wrote about teachers, coaches, parents, or whatever. But from the parenting perspective, the protector was very interesting. Kids were like, yeah, I kind of like that my parents do everything for me because I can just be lazy, but it makes me afraid that I'm going to go out in this world and I'll never be able to be successful or
Mm.
independent.
Mm-hmm.
And so it fundamentally came across as an insult that they're incompetent and as a source of fear. And I think that's what I've tried to articulate in the book, that the protector isn't just we're really loving our kids, we're actually harming them.
Yeah, I think you make that case and it's well spelled out, certainly for me. You've talked a little bit about the research that you've done really on, you could call it generational communication and understanding or misunderstandings. And it's happened seemingly throughout history. I mean, I can only think about American history, certainly in the 20th century. But what is it that every generation seems to get wrong or misunderstand about the kids these days or the younger generation?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of conversation about Gen Z these days and how they don't want to work or how they're entitled or they're too woke and they complain all the time. Um, and look, I get it that it's annoying when young people say, if you're an older adult and you're established in our society and you get to count on the power and privilege that you have as person in charge, and then young people say you shouldn't have that, or that, or they want some sharing in it too. Like I understand why that's annoying, but I don't think it's right to say that their brains are too idiotic to make wise decisions or that they are a broken generation. In part because every generation of adults going back throughout all of recorded human history has complained about teenagers and young
Exactly.
adults. I mean, you can find it in Aristotle, like
Yeah.
Shakespeare, right? Freud. I mean, there's well before not just cell phones, but electricity. This was an issue. And the issue is that yes, actual technology changes, but culture changes too. And culture is often changing every generation. Like each generation has to come up with their own criteria for status and respect. For our parents' generation, it was like listening to the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. And then the great generation said, look at all these long haired hippies smoking dope and going to Woodstock. They're going to ruin the world. Well, guess what? Like that generation created more wealth than the history of the entire world. And so like there are all those complaints were like wrong. And you can go on and on. right? So there's a narrative right now about our current generation that they are kind of broken and flawed or whatever. But on every single health risk indicator, the current generation is the best that it's been in 30 years, and in some cases 50 or 60 years, except for a couple. And the indicators on which young people today are doing better are things like car crashes, drug addiction, teenage pregnancy, all these things in the 90s we were super worried about, like violence, arrests, all these other things. What's down a lot is stuff that is conventional risk behavior. What's up is like mental health problems, and is one thing. And then the other thing is a belief in the American dream, or really just the idea that you, through your efforts, can improve your station in life.
Hmm.
And so young people today are worse off than many previous generations on both mental health and belief in the fairness and justness of our economic system.
Hmm.
And they're not crazy. Like right now, like statistics for upward mobility are terrible. I mean, just look at Raj Chetty's analyses of all tax returns and college going over the last 50 years, 100 years. You can go to the Upshot in New York Times and you can play with the data yourself. Like it has not been this bad in terms of how your efforts can translate into education and therefore wealth since the Gilded Age in like the 1890s, 1880s, right? And so I think this like anxiety and depression is reasonable if you look at a world in which it's impossible for your hard work for many young people to translate into success. And I don't think it's a matter of just convincing them that it could, because in fact, we know that the labor market has hollowed out the middle class. Even like, white collar jobs are being replaced with AI, right? There's mass layoffs, like, you know, economic recession. There's a lot of reasons to be anxious and concerned. So I think it's fully wrong to blame, I don't know, cell phones or social media or whatever else we want to blame for young people in order to explain mental health problems. I think you can just look at our macroeconomic situation along with our political turmoil and constant war and conflict to say, young people have like kind of a point if they're less optimistic than we were in the 80s or 90s.
Sure. Can you speak to the importance of the feelings of status and respect for this age group and how it can influence behavior?
Yeah, so one of the big insights in the book is that, as older generations complain about young people, they say they're not motivated. And they make blanket statements like that. You lack motivation. And I just don't think that's like even close to plausible. I mean, the human brain is designed to like seek out relationships and nutrients, you know, and like not, and those are like basic motivational systems, is to approach it, and in mating and stuff like that, but like to approach nutrients, pleasurable experiences, and relationships and avoid the bad versions of those. Um, those basic brain systems have not changed in 100,000 years. What's changed is like culture. And so the definition of what counts for a good relationship and how we get nutrition, and what attracts a mate, all those things change as culture changes, but the desire for those things hasn't changed at all. And another motivation, of course, is meaning and purpose, right? But again, that has not changed, but like what counts for meaning and purpose could change. And so what I've tried to argue is that um, as young people go from being children taken care of by adults to adults who have to contribute, they have to figure out how to pursue the kind of social well-being that's a hallmark of successful adulthood. And the umbrella label you could put on that is status and respect, or earned prestige is another way to put it. That you kind of, as an adolescent, a young adult, have to earn your reputation as someone of value, someone who can make a contribution, someone who like the rest of their group views as someone that they should keep around and continue giving calories to and protecting from warring tribes or whatever in our evolutionary history. And so those like deep motivations suggest that when we look at young people and say they're not motivated, it might actually be the case that they're highly motivated for something else that's different from what we want them to be motivated by. So a lot of adults want teenagers, for example, to be motivated to factor their trinomials and turn in their homework on time, right? Or go to the gym and exercise. And that's great. I know why adults want that. But, just because they aren't motivated by those things doesn't mean they're not motivated at all. I mean, take the kid who you can't get them to turn in their homework on time, but then ask them to like sneak out of the house and go to a party, right? Like they're like, all right, who do I have to lie to, 3 weeks in advance? Like, where's a map of the sewers? How do I escape? Like I'm going to hack into the Nest camera and, whatever they're going to do. Like they're really motivated when it's something that matters to them, especially something that could bring status and respect, like a night out with your friends. Um, and so I think that often the trick is figuring out that they are really prioritizing status and respect in ways that we as adults forget we care about because we're generally granted status and respect by our societies, by simply by virtue of us having an established position in society, like a stable career. And, like at restaurants, people defer to us, when you're 30s and 40s and 50s. You're surrounded by respect in our culture. And so we want it, but like we generally get it. Whereas young people don't get it, right? Because they're in this culture that's just trashing them all the time. And so once you know that, then it's like, all right, well, how do I reframe a good behavior as consistent with their drive for status and respect? And one of my favorite examples is, so rather than think about eating healthy as like what I, the adult, say you should do in order to promote your health long time in the future. So like eat your broccoli now so you don't have diabetes in your 50s, right? That's like not a compelling argument to a 12-year-old. But refraining from eating hot Cheetos now because scientists and engineers created hot Cheetos specifically to get children addicted to junk food. And then the reason why they have a cartoon cheetah market is so they get children to try it at a really young age. And they made the Cheetos to have the optimal combination of meltiness and cheesiness and spiciness, so that way your tongue salivates and you never know that you've eaten any food, because by the time it goes down your throat, then it's already melted. You know, like basically convince teenagers that they don't want to be manipulated, and therefore eating healthy is a way to stick it to the man. And so right now, I get to feel like a high status 13-year-old because I'm standing up against like corporate interests that are harming the poor in America, right? That's a good reason to eat fruits and vegetables. But like because your parents said that in 30 years you'll regret eating Cheetos, like that's not a good reason to eat fruits and vegetables. So that's an example of how you can tap into the drive for status and respect. And we did that in one experiment, and we find pretty striking increases in kids buying healthy food in the lunchroom when we secretly track their ID cards and we figure out what they bought. And that worked much better than a conventional public health message that just said, here's the food pyramid and here's how calories work and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, there's also a great anecdote in your book about the notoriously poor performing anti-smoking campaigns that have been, I don't know, shoved upon youth. And there's essentially one successful one that it really tapped into what you talked about is convincing people that, look, it's just a bunch of rich corporations trying to like greedily take your money and your health. And that essentially um, was a successful message. But there's a highway that I go down when I drive to pick up my daughter, and there's this vaping billboard on there, and it shows this young teenage girl, and the dad's like scolding her about it. It's like time to talk about vaping. And I just think, my goodness, they're number one, they should get your book, but number two, like they're not learning the lessons of even good marketing. Like all of
Right.
the unsuccessful marketing campaigns that have been in the past of like this, father wagging his finger at the kid, like not only did they not help, but they actually made smoking worse, did they not?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the classic youth smoking campaign was something called Think, Don't Smoke. And the implication is that we, the adults, are thinking, and you, the dumb teenagers, are not thinking. And which is, of course, insulting to young people. Uh, and then the second half is don't smoke. And that's like, I, the adult, think I have the right to tell you what to do and that you don't have any agency or autonomy. And so those three words, think, don't smoke, contained like so many insults that are an affront to teenager status and respect. And on average, they those ads increase teenagers' desire to smoke, potentially their actual rates of smoking. But it also made them think that tobacco companies were great because, like, oh look, they're anti-smoking. So it was some real evil genius stuff happening with Think Don't Smoke. It was pretty amazing. And along about the same time, there was a different campaign led by Alex Boguski, who's a kind of ad man in the late 90s, early 2000s. And he came up with something called the Truth Campaign, which reframed non smoking as a way to stand up against companies that are trying to exploit you. And that led to perhaps the largest decrease in a major public health uh, problematic behavior in the history of the US, maybe tied with seatbelt use uh, in terms of effectiveness of public health campaigns. So something like 30% of all teenagers smoked before the Truth Campaign came out. And then after these commercials ran showing teenagers flooding the streets, rebelling against executives, saying, stop killing us, basically, and in solidarity with their peers, then smoking rates went down to about 5 or 6% across the country. And what that suggests is that, you don't need to like grown splain stuff to teenagers, right? Grown splaining being like, the smart adult, will export the contents of my smart adult brain into your dumb teenage brain. Like that, adults keep thinking that's the right way to motivate behavior change. And there's not a good track record. Instead, if you can reframe the good behavior as consistent with what counts for status and respect in the adolescent milieu, then sometimes you can get striking behavior change at scale.
Grown splain. That's a new one for me, but I know where that's coming from. I'm sure I've been doing plenty of that myself as a parent. A couple minutes ago, you talked about one of my favorite subjects in the world, factoring trinomials. So I know I do that
Yeah.
on a daily basis, and it's just a big part of my life. But you talk about in the book just some beautiful messaging campaigns that you used with maybe some of your research staff or with younger folks about why they should do factoring of trinomials. Why should they do this sort of menial stuff that doesn't seem like they should be doing it? My son just asked me last week about some particular task, and I was doing my best to channel my David Yeager to convince him about why it's best for society and him in the future. But could you just talk a little bit about how we as parents or research senior advisors or whatever it happens to be can convince people why it's important to do either the hard stuff or the boring stuff or the stuff that just doesn't seem like it has a lot of meaning, but it might.
Yeah. I mean, I think that as adults, we are constantly making choices that are meaningful because they're part of our like investment in our future. We're always making like delay of gratification trade-off choices. And for young people, that's like a harder sell. It's kind of like saying, eat broccoli now so you don't have diabetes in your 50s, right? I mean, saying like you should factor trinomials now rather than play with your friends, right? Or read a book or play Nintendo so that in your mid 30s, you can have gone to a slightly better college and then maybe you have enough money to hardly afford a mortgage, right? And it's like, there's no scenario really where an extra trinomial factored means you don't have to like worry about money and like you're, on easy street. So it's like it's a hard sell. And so I did kind of like, yes, of course, young people need to understand that the impact of their investments in their education, but I don't think they need a lecture on that. I think they understand it just because it's part of our culture. Um, and instead, I think they need a reason why their criteria for status and respect right now could be fulfilled by taking their kind of tedious work seriously. That it's specifically what we do in our experiments is we say, hey, um, what's something that makes you mad about the world? Like, or, frustrated or it's wrong with the world. And teenagers are ready to answer that question. They don't have any problem answering that question. They're like, war, injustice, political division, you know, pandemics, like you name it. And then we're like, all right, well, how can a stronger brain help you to do something about that problem? You know, The reason why it's still a problem is that adult generations haven't fixed it yet. And maybe that's because they haven't thought about it in the right way or coordinated in the right way, which of course is true. Like our generation, for as much as we blame, Gen Z, like we haven't really solved any of our major problems, right? Global warming, political division, like economic instability, like none of those things are better than they were in the 90s, right? And so you could say, all right, well, if anyone's going to prevent the world from destruction, like it's going to have to be you guys because we've tried and we haven't done it. So how could a stronger brain help you to make a difference? And then it's like, all right, well, if I do my factoring of trinomials, I'll learn logical reasoning, and logical reasoning will help me to make a difference, right? And young people are actually surprisingly creative in generating reasons why their learning could be related to these issues. It also doesn't matter really how right they are. It just matters that they convince themselves. And in our experiment, we found that that little reflection caused students to do more of their boring math homework, goof off less on the internet, watch fewer videos, and then ultimately get higher grades in their math classes.
Got it. Well, I know that I've employed a lot of the lessons from that book into my parenting style and into my leadership style. So again, the book is 10 to 25. It's fantastic. I again haven't read a ton of parenting books, but I would highly recommend it, and it's had an impact on me. So I just wanted to thank you for writing the book and for all the great research that you've done. It comes from a place of caring and a place of heart, Dr. Yeager. So I really appreciate you, and I just encouraged everybody to pick it up, and I look forward to seeing the work that you'll continue to do for years to come.
Thanks so much for having me.
All
Appreciate
right.
it.
Thank you. Thanks for listening to the Better with Age podcast. I hope you enjoyed my conversation today with Dr. David Yeager. Maybe gathered some insights about your parenting style or leadership style, or ways that you might be able to connect with some of your employees or your kids. His book, 10 to 25, The Science of Motivating Young People, is available anywhere you get your books. I would encourage you to pick up a copy. I certainly enjoyed it myself. If you're interested in learning more about optimal aging and how to build better strength and bone density and health and gut health and all the things that come along as we age, I would encourage you to check out the Better with Age website, www.betterwithage.online. This is a program that my wife, Leah, a nutritionist, and myself, a physical therapist, developed to help you age in the best possible way that you can, so you can continue to do the things that you want to do, live the life that you want to live, and do it on your terms. So that's www.betterwithage.online. Feel free to check it out. And until next time, I'm Galen, signing off.